Right, shalom, shalom. First, I'd like to give all praises unto Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Waharaka Kodash, and double honors unto the apostles and elders of Great Millstone, and honors to you brothers out there in the highways and the byways, teaching this word in all sincerity and in truth. Now, I'm sure you've seen, the headlines with Trump talking about white genocide, and you got the situation with the South African government and land reform, and this is a token gesture, really, when you look into it. Um, the whole South African government is basically a front. When you really break it down, to this day, the so-called white man is still the richest and the most powerful and the most influential in that country. Um, However, this land reform thing, um, um, as you can read here, goes back to 1994. So it says in 1994, the African National Congress government in South Africa set a target of redistributing 30% of commercial farmland to black South Africans. Right? This goal was intended to address historical injustices and concentration of land ownership by white South Africans. While land reform programs have been implemented, the target of 30% has not been fully realized. So I think to this day, it's currently 10% of the land has been redistributed to so-called blacks, to use for farming or whatever, and a lot of those enterprises have failed. Now that one of the things they're going into is redistribution without compensation and all that. But what I want to talk about is human capital, okay? Because you see, there's this thing that comes about that says when these redistribution programs happen, it actually harms the country. And one of the examples they use is Zimbabwe. All right. Now it says the Zimbabwean farming sector suffered a significant collapse in the early 2000s due to former President Robert Mugabe's controversial land reforms, which saw the seizure of mostly white-owned commercial farms and their redistribution to black Zimbabweans. This policy resulted in a sharp decline in agricultural production, food shortages, economic consequences like the closure of processing companies and exporters, and a frozen financial system. Okay. Now, you might say, well, why did that happen? It's because when Esau goes in, right, and he colonizes, being colonized by Esau is a lot different than being subjugated and having to pay tribute. Because what Esau does is he comes in, he takes over all the resources, he puts himself in all the positions of power, all the high value human capital positions. He will position himself, and he will relegate the natives to being basically just beasts of burden. He will set up a system where they don't really have access to education. All right, so what that does is it creates a very low value base, a very low value human capital population. So then when you don't go then to remove these so-called white people, what you're left with is a bunch of people who do not have the available skills, wisdom, or knowledge to operate these systems. It's tantamount, to like going to any Fortune 500 company, taking a bunch of people from the bottom of the company, getting rid of all the management and making them management. The company will collapse because there's a knowledge and a know-how that comes with running companies and running systems, even running farms. To successfully run a farm, especially a high-tech farm, there's certain, and Salakia, this is all by design. You know, Esau destroys and subverts the people and makes you dependent on him. All right, so this is why you see a lot of times people will complain, oh, things were better with colonialism, not understanding that the reason for that is because Esau, the way he manipulates the system, he dumbs the people down. That's part of his oppression. All right, so when he gets moved out of certain positions, it takes time to develop the right people to, you know, replace that. Okay, and so that happened in Zimbabwe, and you actually see that happening in South Africa. You know, these people come in, a lot of times they lack the capital, and a lot of times they lack the know-how to run the farms the way the previous owner run the farms. And that's because they come from generations of people who, again, haven't been raised to have these skills and this know-how. All right, and that's human capital. All right, human capital refers to the knowledge, the skills, and the capabilities of individuals which contribute to their ability to produce value and contribute to economic and social well-being. It's just like if you wanted to build a whole bunch of high-tech factories, you need engineers. Now, if you don't have the engineers, then you can't do that. Do you understand what I'm saying? Or let's say like a particular demographic of people are the engineers, and you get rid of that demographic of people. How you can't? They're not easily replaced. It's a high value skill. It takes years to train people to do that. Okay, so that's what you see happening over there in South Africa in certain places, and this has been repeated throughout the world in a lot of places, give or take, because the more Esau oppresses you, the less you can actually stand on your own 2 feet. You know, that's just part of what Esau does. And you know, it made me start to think about the scripture, because you see, we're gonna be freed from this guy just miraculously, just quickly. And so the Lord is gonna bless us with the right human capital, beginning with the elect, the 144,000. All right, the Lord is gonna give us everything we need to proceed. All right, so we're going to be blessed, just like we were blessed coming out of Egypt. Even though the Egyptian captivity, we had a lot more, say, that we held on to in Egypt than we did in America, so to speak. You know, America was bad, man. America, they broke our people down to nothing, man. It's crazy. But if we go back and we read in Exodus 12:35-36, it says, and the children of Israel did according to the word of Moses, and they borrowed of the Egyptians jewels of silver and jewels of gold and raiment. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, that they lent unto them such things as they required. So one of the things that the Lord gave us that any people needs foundationally in order to build themselves up is capital, right? Money, right? In this case, gold, silver, jewels, right? Capital. When we left Egypt with capital, right? This is of utmost importance. A nation has to have these things. This is why, if you look at even the islands or the British, they compensated the slave owners and not the slaves, because they know that if you so-called free someone, but you don't give them the capital they need to survive and to build and to invest in themselves, they are still dependent. And so they literally going to have to put themselves into slavery anyway. And that's what you saw happening. Whether you want to go to Brazil, whether you want to go to Jamaica, a lot of the slaves ended up back on the same plantations working as cheap labor. Because for one, they didn't really know how to do much else. And And two, they didn't have the capital to do, as free men, they didn't have the capital to do anything else. Because capital gives you freedom, it gives you time, it gives you freedom, right? The amount of freedom you have is ultimately tied to your capital, right? Desperate people don't have much freedom or much choice. Like, for example, let's say you get a guy, he's got land and he's got money. With that money gives him time where he could spend time preparing his next move, investing in his next move. He can have a certain amount of losses before he makes a profit and still be fine. When you don't have capital, you don't have time. You don't have the ability to invest in yourself. You don't have the ability to make losses, right? You're desperate. And so you become a servant to those who have. All right. So having capital is important for a people. All right. If you lose your job tomorrow and you had like millions in your bank and you're not really rushed to go back into work, you have freedom. You have freedom to choose what you're going to do. You have freedom to invest in yourself, freedom to train, freedom to hire. If you lose your job and you ain't got no money, all you're thinking about is getting to the next job as soon as possible, and you'll take or do whatever you need to do because you need to survive. You see the difference? So the Lord, when we came out of Egypt, the Lord made sure that we didn't come out empty-handed. And even if you go into the law of, when you enslave a Hebrew, once the Hebrew would leave the captivity, you would garnish him out of your stock liberally. So he would leave with capital, because if he leaves without capital, chances are he's gonna have to put himself back into slavery to survive. Okay. Next thing, we came out of there with assets, man, flocks, herds, cattle, and not only that, we had the knowledge of how to take care of these cattle. We had the knowledge of rearing these animals because we kept these animals ourselves. So Exodus 12 and 38 says, and the mixed multitude went up also with them, and flocks and herds, even very much cattle. Which our people always did that, going back to Abraham. All right. So we came out with all that, flocks. Now you're talking about if you've got a whole bunch of lamb, then you've got wool. All right, you got cows and stuff, you got leather. All right, these are assets, extremely valuable. And the mixed multitude was extra labor, workers who themselves would have had different skills. All right. So we had human resources on top of that. What else did we have? Exodus 35, 25, and 35. Now this is key. Right? It says, and all the women that were wise-hearted did spin with their hands, and brought that which they had spun, both of blue and of purple, and of scarlet and of fine linen. So again, human capital, the Lord blessed our people with knowledge and skill in all different type of works. All right. And all the women whose hearts stirred them up in wisdom spun goat's hair, and the rulers brought onyx stones. All right, go to Exodus 36, 1 and 2. It says, then wrought Bezaleel and Aholiab, and every wise-hearted man in whom the Lord put wisdom and understanding to know how to work all manner of work for the service of the sanctuary, according to all that the Lord had commanded. And Moses called Bezaleel and Aholiab and every... Oh, he didn't copy the whole thing. Let me get it. 36 and 2. I thought it copied the whole thing. What's going on? And everyone whose heart stirred him up to come onto and to work to it. So these are all different people that the Lord raised up in the skilled artificers and masons and everything of that nature that was necessary for the tabernacle. But all these things are also necessary knowledge, for industry. And the Lord raised our people up in his wisdom. And that's ultimately what's going to happen when, when the Lord brings us into this new kingdom. We're going to be garnished with all the wisdom necessary to run a nation, to run a kingdom. We're not going to be like how Zimbabwe and all these men ended up being falling flat on their face because they've been in captivity for so long under this devil that they didn't know what to do. It's not going to be like that in our kingdom. In our kingdom, from the very beginning, we're going to have first and foremost, we're going to have the most important wisdom, which is the law, statutes, and commandments. We're going to have order. We also going to have the worldly knowledge. We're going to have the knowledge of how to set up a kingdom, man, how to deal with sewage, how to deal with farming, building, architecture, all these things, man. And these are things that the Lord had already blessed us with beforehand. When you go to the book of Daniel, we had these things in abundance, man. Wise men in all these things. And Esau sought to destroy all that. Just, make us into just brute beasts, that only know how to entertain. Where was it? Is it Daniel? Sorry, Daniel's 1. Right. That's why these men was among Judah was sought after by the other nations. They were good human capital, man, because let's look at Daniel. They knew how to run a kingdom. They knew how to get things done. All right. Daniel's 1 and 3. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom and cunning in knowledge and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. Because the most valuable people in a nation is not the entertainers, man. It's the man that know how to do shit. The man that know how to set up systems. The man that knows science. Those are the people of value. And the chief science is that of judgment, which goes by the law, statutes, and commandments. Right? But right now, we're a people that we've been broken down, that our nobles are entertainers. Our chief ones are entertainers. It's crazy. Not to say there aren't jakes with all kind of different skills, right? But as a nation of people, because we're under this devil, we don't run nothing. We don't run these systems that's around us. We might have people that take part in it, but they don't run it, right? But in the kingdom of heaven, we're going to be running everything. We're going to be running everything. Beginning with the 144,000, man, And so I was just thinking about that with Zimbabwe. Like, we ain't going to be like these heathens, Esau take the foot off the neck, and these men don't know what to do because they've been broken down. We're not gonna have that moment where it's like, how do we do this? How we do that? Because Esau's not here to run the system no more. No, the Lord's gonna bless us with all the wisdom, knowledge, and understanding that we need to proceed, man. And we're gonna hit the ground running. It's gonna be beautiful. We're gonna build a new kingdom from the ground up, and we're going to be furnished with all the knowledge necessary, all the science necessary. We're going to have in abundance. The chief people of the earth. We're going to replace Esau. All right. Because right now, Esau is the chief. We're going to replace Esau in his position, man. And it's going to be a beautiful thing. All right. But yeah, I was just thinking about, these different things like running a kingdom. So things ain't always, as simple as people see it as to be. Like Zimbabwe, it took them a while to recover from kicking all them Elamites and them Edomites out the country, man. Because, like I said, the people that were left weren't educated and skilled and didn't have the capital to run these same systems, and it's taken a while for them to build up that knowledge base. But for us, it ain't gonna be no while. You know, the Lord has the power, just like He did in the wilderness, to raise up Israel with wisdom, man, and knowledge, because all wisdom and knowledge comes from the Lord. The Lord can literally download that information into us, man, and we know it, right? And that's exactly what's going to happen. So we're not going to be lacking in any knowledge, wisdom, or understanding. We're not going to be there going, oh, you know what, things were better. No, you know, we're going to be running it with wisdom, knowledge, or understanding far beyond even what is in existence now. That's why all we got to do is be faithful and wait for that deliverance. And with that deliverance is going to come everything. These guys in Zimbabwe, they supposedly came up from underneath Esau, but then they caught hell anyway, because they weren't blessed with the wisdom and knowledge and understanding to run their own system. And that's crazy. All right, but that's what happens when you're under the devil for too long, right? He gonna make it where you're incompetent by design. And the same thing would happen, you know, if you were to give like Negroes in America their independence right now, do you think they could form a coherent nation and run the sewage system and run all these systems? Nah, like that shit will break down, because there'll be a whole bunch of greed. You know, there'll be still a whole bunch of corruption. There'll be a whole bunch of Jake that don't really know what they're doing. You know, some Jakes will know, but some Jakes won't, because we're a people that there's a lot of us that useless, and that's by design. You know, that's by design. It is what it is. You know, a lot of Jakes, they ain't got the knowledge, man. They ain't got the know-how, because Esau be gatekeeping. He be putting in them glass ceilings. You know, Jake ain't got the unity. They don't have the organization. You know, it's a lot, but we gonna get it over 104. That's what the 144,000 is all about. Everything, we gonna get it all. Everything you need to have a fully functional and blessed and productive nation, the Lord is gonna provide us, man. In straight up. Yeah, so it's just something I was meditating on, man. You know, that's why we need the Lord, man. So if that, I'm gonna say shalom.